Well, hello everyone. My name is Amy Goletz, and as Kaylee said, I'm a Lake County Master Gardener volunteer, and we're here to talk tonight about native plants and native bees, two of my favorite subjects. Before we get started on our presentation, I am a Lake County Master Gardener volunteer. It's a wonderful program, and I do want to put a plug in. We hold an annual Home Gardeners Workshop. It is usually in March of the year, so 2024 has already happened. I have chaired the workshop for the past 7 years. It's been a joy, a lot of work, but a lot of fun. That's my last year, so next year I get to go as a regular person. But workshop is an amazing day. For a small fee of, I think we are at $55, you get to hear 4 to 5 speakers, you get breakfast, you get lunch, the food's delicious. We held it at Lake Erie College. A lot of fun. So if you want to be put on the workshop email list and be notified of our next workshop, we don't have a date yet for 2025. You can call that number and ask to be put on the list, or email mgvlakecounty@gmail.com. And this slide I think I can skip over because that's what she was talking about. We also hold, we meaning the Lake County Master Gardener volunteers, hold a Meet Us in the Garden series in conjunction with Mentor Public Library. So this one at the main branch, Saturday, June 1st, they're talking about common gardening mistakes and how to fix them. So those classes are usually the first Saturday of the month at 10 o'clock. It is free, but you do need to register. Before I go any farther, I just have to point out that lovely picture. It's of an Ohio buckeye. So all throughout the presentation, you're going to see photos of native plants, most native to Ohio. This one is native to Ohio. And that is a beautiful picture of spring. That's just the leaves unfurling. That's the color that that plant has in spring when it's just coming out of dormancy. It's absolutely gorgeous. So here's what we're going to talk about today. What is a native? The benefits of native plants, native bees and how to create a bee-friendly habitat, and then going on to some cool facts about bees that I bet you do not know. They're pretty fun. That plant there is Anise hyssop. The botanical name is Agostagi funiculum. Anise hyssop is actually not native to Ohio, but native to North America, about 4 feet tall. I have a beautiful clump growing outside my bathroom window, and from inside, even with the window shut, I can hear the bees buzzing. It attracts that many bees. And what's the coolest thing is that male bumblebees are not allowed to stay in the nest. Their sole purpose is to mate, and then they're kicked out of the nest. So they need to find a place to sleep at night, and they sleep on flowers. And they love my Anise hyssop. So they just grab on with their little teeth and their little claws and sleep. And you can go out early in the morning, about 6:30, and pet them. And they don't even wake up. So I've woken all my kids up and made them go and pet the bees. All right, so what is a native? A native is a plant or a bee that occurs naturally in an ecoregion and habitat where over the course of evolutionary time, it has adapted to the physical conditions and co-evolved with the other species in the ecosystem. So what that means is that native plants have been here for hundreds and thousands of years, and they have grown together with our native wildlife. They're highly dependent upon each other. Another term for native plants is straight species. So if you hear straight species, that is referring to a native. And native is usually used with a geographic qualifier. So you say native to North America, or native to Ohio, or you can even go native to Lake County. This beautiful photo, a yellow wood poppy, it grows in the shade, part shade to full shade. Deer do like it. So I did, speaking of deer, I have little logos. The deer without the red X means that deer do like it. If it has the red X, it means deer leave it alone. But some plants are worth having even if you have to cage or spray. So a native plant is a plant that some people refer to native plants as those here before European settlement, or those found in the wild. So opposed to a native plant, you have cultivars. So what is a cultivar? A plant that has been selected by humans for a particular characteristic. So we're going to use Echinacea purpurea, our purple coneflower. I figure everyone's pretty familiar with that one. Gorgeous prairie plant, highly supportive of our native wildlife. And when I say native wildlife, I'm referring to bees and butterflies and moths and skippers and all pollinators, beneficial insects. The list goes on and on. Echinacea purpurea, the straight species, the native, has a pink petal. And I don't know why they call it purple coneflower, because those petals seem pink to me. But anyway, someone looked at that purple coneflower and decided, wouldn't it be pretty if we made the petals white? So plant breeders created Echinacea purpurea white swan. It is a cultivar of the purple coneflower. You can tell it's a cultivar because cultivar names are noted with single quotation marks. So if you ever buy a plant, Echinacea purpurea, and you see the single quotation marks, you know it's not a straight species. Doesn't mean it's necessarily bad, but it's not a straight species. Cultivars of native plants are sometimes called nativars. It's a bit of greenwashing. I'm kind of guilty of that myself. The problem with cultivars is that most of them are tissue propagated, meaning they take a plant and they grab tissue from this plant and create this plant and this plant and this plant. So these plants are genetically identical to that parent plant, which, if you're planting those out in the wild, it means those plant populations do not have genetic diversity. And it's important for plant populations to have genetic diversity so that they can adapt to stresses like climate change or diseases. When they lack that genetic diversity, they can't adapt. So you need to research before using your cultivars, because not all cultivars are bad. Some natives, when they are cultivated for a certain characteristic, will still support our native wildlife as much as the straight species. So do any of you know Doug Tallamy? Have you heard of Doug Tallamy? Yeah, so Doug Tallamy is an entomologist from the University of Delaware. And he is an amazingly smart person, and he has put a lot of good information into the native plant world. He did a study with his graduate students on woody plants, and they were studying the straight species and cultivars of woody plants to determine, do those cultivars still support our native wildlife? And they found that for certain characteristics, those cultivars do. So characteristics such as disease resistance or altered growth habit, leaf variegation, and enhanced fruiting. If those were the cultivated characteristics, it still seemed to support the native wildlife just fine. For example, Monarda dinema, Jacob Klein. If any of you have grown Monarda, you know it succumbs to powdery mildew. That's just what Monardas do. Usually it happens at the end of the season, so the pollinators have gotten their floral resources. It doesn't seem to affect them that much. It bothers us because the plant doesn't look good. So plant breeders came up with Monarda dinema, Jacob Klein. We know it's a cultivar because of those single quotation marks. It was cultivated for disease resistance. So it still will get powdery mildew, but it gets it later in the season and less severe than the straight species. And in all other aspects, that plant is the same as the straight species, and it still supports for our native wildlife. Similarly, fragrant sumac, gorgeous plant. It's a member of the poison ivy family, but none of it is poisonous. But fragrant sumac, the straight species, can grow 6 feet tall and 10 feet wide. It's a big plant, and not a lot of residential landscapes have room for that. So plant breeders came up with Rus aromatica growlow. Same exact plant, it's just a mini, 2 feet tall and 8 feet wide. It still will support our native wildlife because they still recognize it. The only difference from growlow to the straight species is the altered growth habit, meaning it's more compact. But there are some cultivated characteristics that do affect the plant's support of wildlife. Going back to our purple coneflower, there are other cultivars out there that they call them double-petaled. So I'm picking on razzmatazz. And it's a beautiful flower, and we all think it's very pretty. But if you are a hungry little bee who has evolved over hundreds and thousands of years, programmed to work that hedgehog-like center of the straight species, purple coneflower, and you land on razzmatazz, where's the hedgehog-like center? Where are the floral resources? That bee does not know how to work the flower to get to the nectar and pollen, if they're still even there, because a lot of times they're bred out to create all those petals. So that flower does not support our wildlife. Same with ninebark. Ninebark is a lovely native shrub. It naturally has green leaves and white flowers. There are a number of different cultivars of ninebark. I'm showing summer wine. They have changed the leaf color. They're quite pretty and striking, blacks and purples and copper color and glowing. But the problem is they've changed the plant so much, the pollinators don't recognize it. So not as many pollinators are going to land on ninebark, summer wine versus the straight species. So you really need to research and find out what was that plant cultivated for. So we've talked about natives, we've talked about cultivars. Let's move on to a non-native plant. So a non-native plant is a plant that's been introduced with human help, either intentionally or unintentionally, to a new place or new type of habitat where it was not previously found. Non-native plants do not support our native wildlife because they haven't grown up together, they haven't evolved together. Our native wildlife doesn't recognize those native plants. Here are some familiar plants that you may not know. They are not native, and it's too bad because they're all over the place. Panicle hydrangea, lilacs, hostas, and daylilies. That'd be lovely if they were native. These are plants that I like to say, broadly speaking, there are 3 tiers of plants. So you have that top layer of plants that's a contributing factor. They positively contribute to our ecosystem. Those are your native plants, your straight species. You have a bottom tier where that negatively detracts from our ecosystem. Those are invasive plants, and we're going to talk about those in a second. And then you have a middle tier that's kind of a neutral. It doesn't add anything, it doesn't subtract anything, but it doesn't add anything. And that's where these plants fall. So there's nothing wrong with these plants in particular, except that they're taking up good real estate that a native plant could be growing in and supporting our wildlife. So back to Doug Tallamy, he has suggested that we aim for 70% of our plant biomass in our yard should be native and 30% can be non-native. So you can keep the lilac that reminds you of your mom or the hosta you got from the local plant swap, as long as the remaining 70% of your plant biomass is native. But the problem is when you're figuring out the plant biomass of your yard, you have to include turf grass. So that skews it greatly to the non-native section. So how do we know if a plant is native or non-native? There are websites. I happen to like the USDA plants database, but there's another one that a lot of people like called BONAP. It's BONAP.org, I think. It's the Biota of North American program. But USDA plants database, what you open it up, they ask for your either the scientific name or the common name. So you type it in and it produces this map. And so I used palm sedge, which is Carex muskingumensis. I'm going to talk about Carex in a second, but back to the map, you can see there's Ohio and we're green, which means that that plant is native in Ohio. If it was introduced, that it would be blue. Carex are wonderful, wonderful native plants, and not that many people use them, and it's too bad. They are grass-like plants, but they're not grass. It's a completely different genus. They provide seeds for birds. They are host plants for our skipper butterflies and provide, because they're low growing, a lot of them, nesting habitats for our bees. So you can find a Carex for every situation, sun or shade or wet or dry. And a lot of times what looks really good is when you're planting a garden bed and where you might consider using mulch. If you were to plant Carex in a matrix planting, so you would do your little triangles of Carex and then you plant your big colorful flowers in between, it looks gorgeous. And then you're using a green mulch instead of the hardwood mulch, a green mulch which is supportive of our wildlife. And Carexes, huge bonus, they're all deer resistant. So native plants are the foundation of a healthy, functioning ecosystem. This is another Carex that I wanted to share. I think it's the last one I've shown, but this one is called seersucker sedge. This one is so pretty. This one's my favorite. It's got a thick ribbon-like leaf. See how it's puckered like the Christmas ribbons? And then when it quote unquote flowers, because like you use the term loosely, it's not bright and colorful, those are the flowers. It shoots up a flowering stalk and the stalk is striped. it's like a purple and green, purple, green, purple, green. And then at the end, it gets the little fluffy seed heads. It's just, you have to appreciate the minutia. It's beautiful though. So let's talk about some reasons about why we should plant native plants. I've mentioned this one already. It's to support the local food web. So you want to plant your native plants to provide nectar and pollen by planting plants like nodding onion. Nodding onion is a beautiful plant, 12 to 18 inches tall. The flowering stalk goes up and then curves over slightly so those flowers do nod. Look how pretty that is. It is a happy spreader. You can cut the seed heads down if you want to prevent the spread. Native plants are to be used as host plants, like the New Jersey tea is a host plant for the spring azure butterfly there in the middle. That one, unfortunately, the deer do like. The other two, they don't. A host plant is a plant that a butterfly will lay an egg on. So the female butterflies instinctively know what plants the emerging caterpillar will be able to eat. Because obviously, you're a caterpillar and you come out of an egg, you're not traveling. You're going to eat what you're laying on. Some butterflies are generalist, which means they can lay on a number of different plants. Some are specialist, and they need to lay on one particular plant, like the monarchs who need our milkweed. So if you don't have that plant, you're not going to have that butterfly. Native plants also provide insects, fruits, and seeds. They attract insects for the birds. That's a picture of elderberry, and elderberry is a remarkably productive, supportive plant. So it flowers beautiful white flowers that attract pollinators and beneficial insects. Then it turns into fruit, which the birds absolutely love, and seeds. I will say that the elderberries are very good. You have to act fast, and I'm laughing because I'll share a little story with you. I was a new volunteer gardener at Penitentiary Glen some years ago, and I was working with a bunch of lovely people, and it was elderberry season, and everyone said, okay, we want an elderberry pie. Tuesday morning, we always met 10 to 12. Who's going to make it? So I'm like, all right, I'm new. I'll make the elderberry pie. So, because I have elderberries in my backyard. So I went in the backyard and I took a long time to pick the elderberries. They're quite small. And I picked all the stems off and I picked all the leaves off and I had a great big colander of elderberries. Yes, it's going to be delicious. So I walked inside and I ran it under some water, and then I go and I make my pie crust, and I turn back to mix the elderberries with your sugar, and I look, and oh my goodness, to my horror, the whole colander was moving. I was like, what? Worms. worms out the wazoo. So I ran the colander outside, dumped it at the ground of the elderberry tree. The birds loved it. They had a blast. And then I had to go in, and they were all laughing. I had to admit to the volunteers, I'm like, I don't have the pie. I couldn't do it. So, but it did take about 2 to 3 hours to make, to pick all those elderberries. Oh, well, lesson learned. So native plants require less inputs than non-native plants. I know you can't see it from where you're sitting, but I'll read you those numbers in the middle. So pay attention to the roots of these non-native plants. That's a non-native spirea. We do have native spirea, which is really pretty and very productive, but that's the non-native one. And daylilies and fountain grass. Those fountain grass roots are only going down about 2.5 feet. The turf grass, just a couple inches. Now look to the other side of the screen at the natives. That's prairie dropseed is going down 8 feet. But black-eyed Susan, about 6.5, but 9-bark, which I mentioned before, those roots are going down 15.5 feet, which is wonderful. That's one of the reasons why native plants are so adapted, many of them, to drought. Those roots will decompose in the soil and add nutrients to the soil and add channels for the water to run through. Native plants, when planted in the right place, right plant, right place, it's very important. Native plants will not require any fertilizer, and you don't want to use pesticides. Another reason, this is why you don't want to use pesticides, because native plants attract natural enemies. So natural enemies are good garden bugs, and I wasn't sure about the order of the slide. Let me pop forward for a second. These are natural enemies. These are beneficial insects that promote biological control. So the pictures that you are looking at of these insects predate or parasitize pest insects. So if you see these insects in your garden, yay, you want them there. Lady beetles, hoverflies. The picture to the right, that is a wheel bug, and it's called a wheel bug because it has this structure on its back. It's like a cog. It looks just like a wheel. And do you see what it's eating? A Japanese beetle. Yes, we love wheel bugs. And they're here, they're out in your backyard. And if you plant the native plants on this slide, let's go back one, these plants in particular attract those beneficial insects. And this plant list I took from a book called Good Garden Bugs. It's by Mary Gardner, who is a professor at Ohio State University. It's a great book. It talks about the good bugs, it talks about the bad bugs, it talks about the plants that you need. It's a very informative book. But your traditionals, your commons, I think, asters, blazing stars, coneflowers, Culver's root, that's a picture of Culver's root, this first one on the left. Giant hyssop, goldenrods, of course, very beneficial. Ironweed is up at the top, mountain mints, and then spiderwort to the right. All of those plants, if you have those, you are going to have those beneficial insects which will predate and parasitize the pest insect. There is often a lag period. You're going to see the pest and think, okay, where are the good guys? Give them a day or two, maybe a couple days. They need to find them, and then they come and get them. And then you want to plant native plants to preserve the natural characteristic of a region. So we want to plant plants native to Ohio. So when you're in Ohio, you're looking around and you know you're in Ohio. And you want to know you're in Maine if you're up there, or Texas if you're down there. These three plants are all native to Ohio. Gorgeous, gorgeous plants. Black chokeberry is a shrub. It's from the rose family. You can tell those flowers are pretty typical of the rose family. It's about 6 feet tall, about 3 to 4 feet wide, so it's a very small shrub, very doable for a home landscape. Butterfly milkweed is the milkweed that's short. It's just about 2 to 3 feet tall. It makes a nice little mound. It still attracts as many butterflies as the taller pink ones. This one grows in a different habitat than the other two common milkweeds, common milkweed and swamp milkweed. This one likes it hotter and drier. Common milkweed and swamp milkweed, otherwise known as rose milkweed, like it medium to moist. And then false sunflower is a cheery pop of color for your garden. That's about 4 feet tall, 3 feet wide. The final reason to plant native plants, or maybe not the final, but close to it, is to prevent the spread of invasive plants. So what is an invasive plant? An invasive plant is a non-native plant that outcompetes our native plants for space, light, nutrients, and water. So Ohio has an invasive plant council, and they publish a list of the top invasives in Ohio. So I took these 4 from their list because these are 4 that I have personally battled. Multiflora rose, purple loosestrife, garlic mustard, and Japanese honeysuckle. And I was pleased to find a photo of a bee on the Japanese honeysuckle because it brings up a good point. There are different qualities of nectar and pollen, and a pollinator nectaring on a non-native invasive, it's like us eating fast food. It's not good for them. It would be much better for her to be on a native honeysuckle. And there are a couple beautiful native honeysuckles. And then just because a plant isn't currently on the invasive plant council's list doesn't mean it's not going to be. I've talked to them about this one and they're watching it. Butterfly bush is a non-native, potentially invasive plant. It is from Asia. It has no predators here. It self-seeds in the wild, and it provides a very low quality nectar for butterflies. And I know some people are very happy. I hate that it's named butterfly bush, and butterflies do flock to it, and that's very unfortunate. They are not getting a good quality nectar from butterfly bush. So if you want to replace your butterfly bush, which I would highly recommend, if you need that purple color in your garden, you could do New England aster or dense blazing star. Those are both beautiful. Those are perennials, so they will die back. If you're looking for a shrub, summer sweet, Clethra alnifolia, has the same kind of flowers. Summer sweet is amazing. It's called that because it does smell wonderfully sweet. It flowers later in the summer to early fall, and it will flower in part shade. Okay, this is the last reason to plant native plants. It's because they are absolutely gorgeous. So wild bergamot, otherwise known as Monarda fistulosa, has a special value to native bees, meaning they flock to it, and it's extremely supportive of our native bees. Isn't that a beautiful bee on that flower? Really like that. The plant in the middle is called rattlesnake master. That's a really cool plant. It looks like a yucca, but it's not. And it gets to be about 4 to 5 feet tall, and it's stiff. So I use it in my gardens to hold up other floppy plants. And despite the fact that those blooms look so prickly, they're not, and the pollinators flock to them. The rattlesnake master is covered with pollinators. And then for the shade, hairy alum root, or Heuchera villosa, that's a beautiful heuchera. That's our native heuchera. And the underside of that leaf is a violet color. It's so pretty. And that will shoot up little airy panicles of flowers that attract small bees and hummingbirds. So moving on to bees, we have over 4,000 species of bees in the United States and Canada, and approximately 500 species in Ohio. And it's approximately because we're still finding and discovering bees. So here's a little crash course on our native bees. These facts that I'm going to share with you, they don't apply to honeybees. Honeybees do provide services for us, but they're not native. So going to our native bees, 90% of our native bees are solitary, which means they do not have a colony. The other 10% would include our bumblebees. That's the exception because they do have a colony. The mother bee, for the 90%, the mother bee will forage, build the nest, lay the egg all by herself. It's a lot of work, except for those bumblebees, like I said, that have their colony and their female worker, their caste system with the queens and the workers and the drones. Most bees are short-lived and live only 5 to 8 weeks of the growing season. So the bees that you see in the spring are not the same bees that you see in the fall, completely different species. 25% of our bees are specialists, which means they want to nectar on a particular flower. And again, if you don't have that flower, we won't have the bee. And do they sting? Actually, no. Because there is no colony to defend, they're not aggressive bees. And I have pet many, many, many bees, and I have not gotten stung. And 70% of our bees are ground nesters. So that's why you want to go easy on the mulch, because bees cannot dig through mulch to get into the ground. They need bare soil. That is a beautiful plant called wild strawberry, Fragaria virginiana. And I don't know if any of you have ever heard Dan Jaffe Wilder speak. He's an excellent speaker, and he has a presentation, I think you can find it online, called Kill Your Lawn. He hates turf grass. So because it doesn't provide, see, you do too, it doesn't provide for our wildlife. And wild strawberry is a great alternative to turf grass. And he has a wild strawberry lawn, and he says, I'm gonna do one this year. He said that he has dogs, he has chickens, and he entertains all on the strawberry lawn. So we should all plant strawberries. Here's a couple photos of our native bees, just so you can see them close up. The two largest bees you're going to see are on the end, the common eastern bumblebee and the eastern carpenter bee. And the way you tell them apart is that the common eastern bumblebee is very hairy, if you look at their backside, and the carpenter bee does not have hair on its backside. It's rather shiny, so we tell the kids, carpenter bees have shiny heinies. So, and that's how you tell the difference. Mason bees are called that. Isn't that a beautiful bee? They're called that because they use mud to build their nests, and mining bees build their nests in holes, burrows in the ground. So they mine the ground. Striped sweat bees. Sweat bees are called sweat bees because they like to lick the sweat off of your hands and your arms. And the cellophane bee creates this material, this mixture of saliva and other materials, and lines her nest with that mixture, that saliva mixture, and it looks just like cellophane. And that's what she would lay her eggs into. And then the small carpenter bee, no relation to the eastern carpenter bee. She's a separate species all to herself. She likes to nest in wood, but she needs wood with cavities that are already there because she's too small to chew it for herself. She's very tiny. This is a super cool bee. It's an alfalfa leafcutter bee. And so this bee it lines its nests that it's going to lay, lines its brood cells, where it will lay the eggs with leaves. And what it does is it stands on a leaf edge, and then it starts chewing. It gets in a circle and it gets over here and the leaf edge falls away and it falls with it, and it's so graceful. Scoops up the edges of the leaves and flies off to wherever it's building its nest. And they build nests in crazy places. Last year, I have a hose mobile with 4 nails or screws, and one of the screws was gone, and I spent all afternoon watching an alfalfa leafcutter bee go in and out and in and out and built the nest in my hose mobile. Then my husband was upset because I said, "You can't move the hose mobile. There's some bees nesting in there." We hooked up another hose, we were fine. And look at that face. How would you not want that in your backyard? So that's a squash bee. And if you plant squash, you are gonna get that bee. So now we'll talk about some tips on how to create a bee-friendly habitat. And I have that asterisk because it's so wonderful. When you create a habitat for bees, you are also creating inadvertently a habitat for beetles and butterflies and flies and hummingbirds and moths and wasps and birds, because a lot of these tips apply to all of those groups. We focus on bees, and I would recommend trying to attract bees to your garden. Bees are the most effective pollinator. They're the only pollinator that intentionally collects nectar and pollen throughout their whole life, because they're the only pollinators that feed exclusively on nectar and pollen throughout their entire life. This is a picture of a green sweat bee on Helen's flower, which used to be called sneezeweed, but no one bought it because they thought it made you sneeze. It doesn't make you sneeze. So they changed the name to Helen's flower. But that's a beautiful flower. It can get 4 to 5 feet tall. It likes it medium to moist. It blooms in the fall. So again, with your goldenrods and asters, perfect floral resources for our pollinators in the fall. And that little inset picture, that's a picture of a bee larva on bee bread. And bee bread is a mixture of nectar and pollen. So when the mother bee goes out, the female bee goes out and collects that nectar and pollen, and she literally rolls it into a very circular ball. It's kind of cool. And then lays the egg on top. That bee bread contains everything that bee will need from being a larva to an adult. Okay, so tip number 1 is we need to feed the bees all season long. We need a succession of blooms from spring throughout fall, and not one plant is going to bloom by itself from spring to fall. So you need to figure out your pattern of plants. This is just one possibility. The possibilities, of course, are endless. But I started with bloodroot, which is a spring ephemeral, so it emerges nice and early in March and April. Golden Alexanders are May to June. Bloodroot is very, very tiny, and it's really cool because the leaves are wrapped around the flower and then they unfurl. You can see this in the metro parks when you're walking around. Golden Alexander likes it medium to moist, full sun to part shade. It's about 3 feet tall, beautiful blooms. Blue vervain, interesting because those flower heads bloom from the bottom up instead of the top down like most other spiky flowers. And then in the fall, of course, you want your selection of goldenrods and asters, and again, Helen's flower. So here's a problem. So our queen bumblebees emerge quite early in spring, but our perennial gardens are not growing yet. So she is looking for floral resources to start to build her new colony, because bumblebee colonies all die off. Everyone dies off at the end of the season except for those queen bees. And so they find a place to hibernate, they overwinter, and in the spring they start building that colony up again. So she needs floral resources to lay her eggs upon to make her little bee bread. So she needs us to plant native spring blooming trees, because trees, I'm going to go on to the next slide, but before I do, this is so cool. Look at her. This is her little tongue right there. Yeah, sucking the nectar out of that plant. Super cool. So tree blossoms provide an excellent food source. So again, just a sampling of trees here. These are some of my favorites, but there's tons of trees to choose from. So serviceberry trees, I love them. There's a number of different species that are native to Ohio, 25 to 40 feet tall, but there's even serviceberry shrubs that can be 5 foot tall, 5 foot wide. The flowers emerge before the leaves do. Beautiful white flowers, then red berries that the birds absolutely adore. Pussy willows, that little bee is on a pussy willow. Pussy willows are either male or female. Either way, they provide a lot of floral resources for our bees. The bottom left picture is a tulip tree, and tulip trees are the ones you see in the park with the incredibly straight trunk. They're very, very tall, and the flower is absolutely gorgeous. It really does look like a tulip, and we never know that they're flowering until you see the petals on the ground, and then you look up, oh, I missed it again. And then a basswood. Basswoods are called, the botanical name is Tilia americana. Basswoods are otherwise known as the bee tree because they attract so many bees. Oh, and if you want a list of Ohio trees for bees, Denise Ellsworth, who is the program director of pollination education, she's amazing too. If you ever have a chance to go to any of her programs, listen to any of her webinars, she's awesome. She ran a couple courses, and I don't know if she's still doing it or not, on pollinator advocates, we were called. It was a fascinating course, and we really dug in deep to the lives of bees. But she has a fact sheet called Ohio Trees for Bees, and it is online. And it's a wonderful source of what trees to plant to support our bees. You want to plant your perennials in clumps of at least 3 plants. So if you're trying to attract butterflies are flying high, they don't have great vision, they're looking for masses of color. That's where they're going to land. So if you just have 1 plant, they very well might miss it. These 2 plants, wonderful plants, sweet coneflower, it's another Rudbeckia, not used as much as black-eyed Susan, but it should be. And then Jacob's ladder will grow in the shade. Sweet coneflowers in the sun. And Jacob's ladder has a bee, a specialist bee, that if we don't have Jacob's ladder, we wouldn't have that bee. That's a pretty plant. Jacob's ladder is small. It's like it's a ground cover, but you can't walk on it. About 1 foot tall, 1 foot wide, beautiful, almost fern-like leaves, and then those gorgeous flowers in the spring. You also want to plant in groups to attract bees and make the bee lives easier. Bees have a behavior called flower fidelity or flower constancy, and that's a behavior that on one foraging trip, the bee will go out and be faithful to one flower, meaning that if it lands on a geranium maculatum, our wild geranium, and it gathers nectar and pollen from that, when it leaves that flower, it's going to go to another geranium, then another geranium, then another geranium. And as it's gathering the nectar and pollen, I'm going to use bumblebees as an example, they have little cutouts on their legs. So that's where they pack all that nectar and pollen. And when she's so heavy, she has to go back to the nest to unload. She unloads, she goes back out again, and on that trip, she might be faithful to the second flower, Silene regia, royal catchfly. So she's not going to visit a geranium, then a royal catchfly, then a mountain mint, and then a coneflower in one foraging trip. She doesn't do that. She's too effective a pollinator, and it is thought that it's hard for the bee to memorize the flower. They need to know where are the floral resources located and how do I work that flower to get to those floral resources. So if they're repeating that behavior over and over again on the same flower, that's more effective for them. The flower appreciates the flower fidelity practice of the bee because the pollen of the geranium maculatum is being deposited on another geranium maculatum that can use it. If the bee were to visit a geranium and then go to a royal catchfly, that's wasted pollen because pollen is specific to the flower. So you want to plant a variety of flower shapes, sizes, and colors to accommodate a variety of pollinators. They've done studies on bees, and they have learned that a bee prefers to visit a flower whose depth of the petals matches the length of their tongue. So long-tongued bees want a long tubular flower like Penstemon digitalis. And short-tongued bees want a shorter flower, that's our mountain mint. And then there's pollinators who are, I wouldn't say clumsy flyers, but they need to land before they eat. They can't eat on the fly. So you need what we call landing pad flowers. So the butterfly or the beetle can land on the flower and then nectar. These are just 2 interesting behaviors that I thought you might appreciate. The flower on the left, that's our pink turtlehead. And can you see the bee in there? Isn't that cute? So the turtlehead flower, those petals are closed fairly tightly and they need a big bee to be able to be strong enough to force that petal open because the floral resources are at the bottom of the flower. So I have seen that before, and actually sometimes the bee is completely immersed in the flower and all you see is a flower popping around while she's doing her little thing in there, and then all of a sudden she pops out. Super cute. And then the photo on the right is a process called nectar robbing. So this is a large carpenter bee who cannot fit inside that salvia flower but wants the nectar. So she pierces the outside of the flower. Now the flower does not like this because the bee is getting the floral reward without performing the service of pollination. In addition to which, it leaves holes, visible holes in that flower, so that the little bees who should be pollinating that find the flower unattractive and don't pollinate it. And then if you're trying to attract bees, bees prefer flowers in shades of pink and purple and blue. My favorite colors, that works perfectly for me. And then they also like white and white and yellow. They don't see red with their eyesight, so they don't tend to visit red flowers. Not that they never do, but they don't tend to. Tip number 4 for creating your bee-friendly habitat, you have to include native grasses. And this is a hard sell for people because people are not interested in grasses, but again, they're so beautiful. In addition to which, they are host plants for Lepidoptera, which means our butterflies and moths. When you leave those grasses standing over winter, it provides seeds for our birds, and then also nesting habitat for your bees and birds and other small animals. So what I tell people to do is you plant your native grass, and then you just leave it alone. It grows, it seeds, it flops over the winter. In the spring, you don't even need to clean it up. I don't. And the new growth will come right up through the old. Then the plant debris lays on the ground, it decomposes. That's your nutrients for your soil and nesting habitats. And there's so many different native grasses. I just have 8 up here, but there's so many pretty ones. Switchgrass is a spreader, so you need some room for that one. Little blue stem, about 4 foot tall, and those fronds really do get blue in the summer and a beautiful gold in the fall with silvery seed heads. It's quite picturesque. Purple lovegrass has purple seeds that can detach and blow like a little tumbleweed. And then Indian grass is a nice one for those who like miscanthus grass, which is a non-native grass. If you have it, don't tell me, go home and rip it out. But it plumes. I will say it's got a beautiful plume, so does Indian grass. So if you want that plume, you plant Indian grass. Prairie dropseed, a nice contained grass, about 2 feet tall. Most of the foliage is down there, a nice round ball kind of grass. And then it pops up beautiful, delicate seed heads, which some people say, I don't have a sense of smell. Some people say it smells like buttered popcorn. I don't smell it, but my friend insists it does, so I'll believe her. Side oats grama has a grass frond that arches over, and then all the seeds are on the same side and just dangle. It's super pretty. And tufted hairgrass, there are a number of grasses that grow in the shade, tufted hairgrass being one of them. So having shade is no excuse for not having grass. You want to minimize your maintenance, which this one is wonderful. If you need an excuse to be lazy, you say you're making a bee habitat. You leave the seeds, you leave the stems, you leave the leaves, you leave the dead trees if it's safe, and out of the way. You leave the brush pile, you can even leave some weeds. And you don't want to clean up too early in the spring because hopefully all of your native bees and pollinators nesting underneath your grasses, they seem to need 3 consecutive days of 50 degrees or more to emerge, and then you can go ahead and clean up. So it really pains me, and I've almost wanted to stop, when we get that January thaw and everyone goes out and cuts their grasses and rakes their leaves, and they're just killing so many of our beautiful little pollinators. Bee hotels are very popular these days. You have to watch those. They are not necessarily the best thing. Not only if you have one, you have to make sure you sanitize them because they're very prone to disease, but also if they're being used, it segregates a lot of bees in one spot, making them vulnerable to predation. So it would be much better to be natural and just don't use mulch. Use your leave exposed ground so the bees can burrow in it. Leave the leaves, that's a queen bee looking for a nest. And you can leave the stems because bees will nest inside those stems. I don't know if you can tell that little insert, that's a little bee head sticking out of that. So if you want to learn to do that, Heather Holm, who is a wonderful biologist and conservationalist, she has a website. If you just type in Heather Holm, it'll come up. But she creates graphics, which she very generously shares. And there is a how to create a stem nesting habitat. It pretty much is that you leave your stems standing over winter. If in the spring, you can cut them in varying lengths from, I think it's 8 to 24 inches tall, and then you leave those, because then the bees will nest in the spring. You have to leave those standing in the summer because they'll complete their life cycle. And again, just like the grasses, your new plant will grow up right through the old stems that you leave standing. And you know what? In a couple weeks, you can't even tell that there's stems there. So you want to make sure to eliminate pesticides wherever possible. Pesticides may kill our beneficial insects outright, or they can affect their behavior so much and make them susceptible to disease. Systemic pesticides are dreadful because, so if you have a tree with a problem and someone tells you use a systemic pesticide, you pour it around the tree. Well, the tree takes that pesticide up, and then that pesticide is available or present in every part of the tree, even the nectar and pollen. So then you have the bees come and nectar, and they take the pollen back to the nest, and they're feeding their babies poison. Same thing with pesticide dust. They've noticed that sometimes bees will pick up those pesticide dust grains, thinking they're grains of pollen, and bringing them back to the nest. So here's my own personal story that I thought I'd share with you. Back in the day, before I knew then what I know now, I was weeding in my yard. I have a beautiful pussy willow tree, and it was rather startling. My head is under the pussy willow, and I look up, and at this branch right there, it was just covered in insects. Gross. So it was giant willow aphids, and they were rather large, way too large to be that close to my face. So I figured out what they were, and of course, whatever website I was on said, well, if you've got aphids, you need to use horticultural oil to get rid of them. That was the least poisonous of what they offered. And so I thought, well, isn't that a good thing? You're killing these bad bugs. So I went to the big box store and I got my horticultural oil in the next day or two. And then I came back, and thank goodness, before I even sprayed, I actually had the bottle in hand, and I noticed that the tree was covered in ladybugs and ladybug larvae all over the place. So I took a step back and I stood there and watched for a minute, and I realized the lady beetle larvae were eating the aphids, just munching away, having a lovely old time. And so I thankfully put the spray away, and I watched, and over the next couple of days, the lady beetle population blossomed and the aphids were gone. In a week, all the aphids were gone. So I was so glad I didn't spray, because who was I to deprive those lady beetles of their Thanksgiving feast? And I didn't need to use a pesticide. And so that's what I was saying before about sometimes there's that lag time. You know, definitely the aphids were there first, and it took a couple days for the lady beetles to find them, but they did, and they always will. So bee-friendly, pollinator-friendly, bird-friendly habitats need a water source. So you can provide a water source like a fountain with some cute stone turtles in there, or just put stones in there because bees can't swim, so they need some place to perch to drink their water. Or you can again go natural and plant a cup plant. Does anyone know cup plants? Cup plants are a beautiful plant. They are a happy reseeder, and they are big, so you need space. But it's super cool because you can see the leaves cup the stem, and water does pool in there. And I have had tree frogs in my cup plant, and birds drink from the cup plant, the bees drink from the cup plant, and the bees and beneficial insects love those flowers. And you have to make sure, which is hard to do, and I don't do it enough, to sit down in your garden after you create your habitat and enjoy all of this beauty you've created and all the visitors that will be coming to your garden, because they will come. I have a couple slides here to talk about attracting pollinators to a shade garden. It's harder, but it can be done. So these are a list of plants that will bloom in the spring in the shade. And a lot of our native plants are, even the full sun lovers, full sun to part shade. Full shade's kind of hard, but part shade's not that bad. So you can use dwarf crested iris, which is a very low growing plant. Eastern redbud is there in the middle. Beautiful spring flowering plant, highly productive. Again, the flowers come out before the leaves on that tree. And then fragrant sumac we talked about before, service berries, and spicebush, which is the photo to the right there. And then Virginia bluebells. I've seen bumblebees love Virginia bluebells. I love going to the park when there's a mass planting of Virginia bluebells. Summer bloomers include monarda and bottlebrush buckeye, and columbine, which is a beautiful plant. That's the top left. There's goldenrods that bloom in the sun and in the shade, same with asters, sedges, again, for sun or for shade, and wild geraniums. And then for fall, go to, again, asters and goldenrods, bloom it all throughout summer to fall. Ironweeds, New Jersey tea, and then summer sweet, which we talked about before. Joe Pye weed is a beautiful, beautiful, and very supportive plant. Again, it's kind of big, but oh my goodness, the pollinators and beneficial insects love that plant. Okay, so here's some cool facts coming for the bees. All right, so say you invite your bees, you build your habitat and you've got your bees, and you're watching the bee and you're wondering, is it a male or female? Because I know you would wonder that. And then what you would have to do is count the segments on its antenna. So female bees have 10 segments on their antennas, and male bees have 11. So this is a male. How cool is that? This is one of the things we did during that pollinator advocacy program, is you have bees and you're looking at them under the microscope and you can count the segments of the antenna. This one I think is the coolest one. A female bee can determine the gender of the egg that it's laying. So that female bumblebee, the queen bumblebee, if she wants a female bee, she will fertilize the egg. If she wants a male bee, she withholds that sperm, and then the male bee is developed. And that's important, especially with the bumblebees, because all the females are workers. The males are not. So you want a lot more females than you want males. In addition to which, they've done studies and realized that, this gives me a giggle, that when the queen bee is building the nest and they're laying their eggs, the male eggs are usually laid at the entrance of the nest, where the females are in the back, so that if a woodpecker discovers the nest, well, sorry guys, that's right, you're not that important, go ahead, get eaten by the woodpecker, and the important workers are in the back, all nice and safe. Bees have 5 eyes on their heads. They have those 3 tiny little eyes on what we call a forehead, and those are ocelli, and they are used to triangulate the position of the sun in relation to the nest so they can fly back home. And then you have 2 larger compound eyes that you can see, that's where they can see space and light and color. Okay, and then bees see differently than we do. They can see ultraviolet light. So many flowers will have what are called nectar guides. So there are lines or designs or patterns on the flower that will guide that bee down to wherever the floral resources are located, usually in the center of the flower. So what we see is just that beautiful yellow flower, and what a bee sees is, oh, this is where the nectar and pollen are located. Some flowers do have visible nectar guides, like Penstemon digitalis. If you look at those flowers, there are delicate little purple lines, and they go from the edge of the petal all the way down to the middle. It's kind of like a runway, you know, for the bee to follow down to where the floral resources are located. Okay, when bees fly through the air, they are continually having these little microscopic collisions, and it leaves the bee positively charged. Flowers are naturally negatively charged, and you can find videos online where the bee approaches the flower, and without touching the flower, it hasn't landed yet, pollen grains will jump from the flower to the bee because of those differences in charges. It's really cool to watch. When the bee lands on the flower, it changes the charge of the flower to positive, from negative to positive. Then it nectars and it leaves. And coolly enough, it takes the flower the same amount of time to replenish the nectar source as it does to return to a negative charge. So if another bee comes and lands before it's negative, when the flower is still positive, it's like a sign saying, close for lunch, come back soon, I'm empty. And then the nectar refills and the flower returns to a negative charge, and then the bee knows that it's available to pollinate. Flowers have different color pollen, which you can see as evidenced as what's on these bees. So the top picture is Spring Beauty, which has a beautiful baby pink pollen. That's yarrow with the bright yellow pollen, and the those deep purple flowers of ironweed have a white, creamy white pollen. And bees carry pollen in different places, thankfully, because it makes it easier for us to tell what kind of bee it is. So eastern bumblebees, like I said, have that scopa on their legs that they can pack the nectar and pollen in. The alfalfa leafcutter bee, the one that cuts the circles out of the leaves, carries their pollen on the bottom of their abdomen. And then the mining bees carry their pollen, like if you can say a bee has underarms, that's where it's carrying it. Okay, so if you need help identifying any insects or plants, the Lake County Master Gardeners offer a service called Helpline, where you can call or email, and we will research your horticultural question or your entomological question for free. Usually we get back to you in a couple days. You can also use apps. I like iNaturalist.org. That one's a good one because there are experts in the field. So you would take a picture, you'd submit it, your observation, and then there are experts in the field that get a lot of joy out of going through all those observations and verifying it is what you thought, or nope, you were wrong, it's something else. If you're looking for plant information, the Missouri Botanical Garden Plant Finder is an excellent resource. I use it all the time. That one is nice not only because if you see next to the name Helenium autumnale, there's a little microphone. You can click on that. It gives you the botanical pronunciation, which is very helpful. But it will also tell you not only all the cultural information and a description of the plant, it will let you know if the plant's invasive. If it's invasive, it has a link to the invasive plant atlas. Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center has a plant database, which is also very helpful because they've partnered with the Xerces Society so that if a plant is of particular value to a group of pollinators, it will be listed on that website. Where should you go to buy native plants? There is a wonderfully information-packed website called OhioNativePlantMonth.org. And if you go to that website, you will find a lot of information on native plants, including how Ohio was the first state to create Ohio Native Plant Month, which is pretty exciting. So April is our Ohio Native Plant Month, even though every month should be Ohio Native Plant Month, but April's especially important. And that's it. So thank you very much. I can answer questions if you have any. And there's our bumblebee, a perplexing bumblebee it's called, because the pattern is hard to determine which bee it is, on the Virginia bluebells. I took that picture just walking in the metro parks. There you go. I hope you enjoyed it.